Everyone present that this meeting is being broadcast live via the County Council's website and will also be available for viewing after the meeting. Can everyone please switch on their microphones when speaking and then turn them off when they have finished, please. I have received apologies from Mrs. Maggie Wright, and Mr. Licorice will be acting as her substitute. I've also had, and from Mr. Sheehan, and Mrs. Hack is acting as his substitute as well. I've got further apologies from Mrs. Wright. Okay, I propose that the minutes from the last meeting held on the 4th of June are taken as read and confirmed. Is everybody in agreement to this, please? Thank you very much. Right, questions. I've received 2 questions from Mrs. Dudfield and Mrs. Whitting under Standing Order 35. I will invite Mrs. Dudfield to the table, please. Everyone should have a copy of the question and answer, so these can be taken as read. Mrs. Whitfield, would you like to ask your supplementary question? But can I remind you that this is to highlight, it should be to clarify the response you have been given and should not raise any new issues. Thank you.
My supplementary question is, does Oakfield have the capacity to cope with the 1,600 or so exclusions from primary schools every year? Yes, my subsequent question is, does Oakfield have the capacity to cope with the 1,600 or so exclusions from primary schools every year?
Thank you, Shirley. Can I ask an officer to respond to that, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The exclusion rates in Leicestershire are exceptionally low. I'm not sure where the 1,600 come from. I'm assuming it might be around fixed-term exclusions. But in Leicestershire, the exclusion rates for both secondary and primary are low. And at the moment, the provision that's provided through Oakfield, both in terms of the outreach as well as the work we do in schools, is adequate to support the primary sector. However, this is an area that we are looking at in terms of kind of future-proofing and making sure we've got the resource.
Thank you very
much. Thank you. I would invite you to stay for the rest of the meeting, but if you could sit down for now. Right, I will now invite Sue Whitting to the table. Again, everyone should have a copy of the question and answer, so this will be taken as read. Mrs. Whitfield, would you like to ask a supplementary question? Thank you.
I don't have a supplementary question, but my name is Whiting.
Sorry. I do apologise.
That's okay. And I look forward to getting details in September of the preparations that are being made for the Dyslexia Awareness Week in October. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll get into this now. I have received no questions under the standing order. Right. I've not also been notified of any urgent items. And do any members have any interests they wish to declare? Right, a petition is going to be handed in. Entitled Save Our Children's Centre and signed by 4,283 people. As there is a report on this matter at Agenda 8, the petition will be considered at this point. The only item on today's agenda is the Early Help Review Family Wellbeing Service. This report is being submitted to the Cabinet at its meeting on Friday the 6th of July, and we are invited to comment on the proposals. I will first ask Jane Moore, Assistant Director, to introduce the report. I will then invite the petitioner to the table and present their petition. Jane, would you like to introduce your report?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Is that okay? Yeah. Thank you, Chair. This report sets out the proposals that are being taken to Cabinet on the 6th of July in relation to the early help review. The report also sets out the results of the public consultation and the changes made as a result of the consultation and proposed revised delivery model. You'll see in paragraph 3 that it's recommended to Cabinet that the results of the public consultation are noted, that the number of children's centres is reduced from 36 to 18, and that the Director be authorised to develop and implement the new family wellbeing service, including the remodelling of staff and delivering a buildings model. If I can take you to paragraph 15, page 5, you'll note that the resource implications associated with the early help review. The MTFS requires a saving of 1.5 million in 1920, and alongside this it is expected that the Ministry of Housing and Local Government and partner contributions associated with SLF will cease after 1920, leaving a funding gap of 2.3 million. In January 2018, it was agreed that the County Council would provide an additional 2.2 million to support frontline services through an increase in council tax. And this money, coupled with improved payment by results outcomes, postpones the requirement for the department to deliver the 2.3 million shortfall until November 2020. So the proposals in this report set out the plans to meet the 1.5 medium-term financial strategy savings. If I can take you to page 7, paragraphs 21 to 23, we've set out the background around how we currently deliver our early help services, how they're managed and also where we deliver those from. In relation to the consultation, in January 2018, Cabinet agreed that we could go out and consult on two things: proposals to integrate our 4 services into one, and also to reduce the number of centres from 40 to 15. And page 8 lists the buildings that we were proposing to reduce. The consultation ran from the 22nd of January to the 22nd of April. We received 794 responses to the survey, and over half of those people were people who used early help services. We've detailed the full details of the consultation responses and also a summary of the information given at events in Appendixes I and J. In general, the majority of respondents were in favour of an integrated whole family service approach, but many respondents did make it clear that they didn't support the proposals to close centres. We're also concerned about the future locations of buildings and also accessibility of buildings. The events held also included significant comments on the importance of volunteers in the delivery of early intervention. Alongside the consultation, we have also received a number of petitions as earlier detailed, and we've listed those petitions in paragraph 37. So in considering which buildings we wanted to retain going forward, we developed a rationale for selection, which we've detailed at paragraph 38. That rationale has remained unchanged in relation to the proposals that we're putting before Cabinet on Friday. And the rationale is around the location of centres, the suitability of centres, accessibility, how buildings are currently used, and also some of the practicalities associated with centres. So therefore, taking account of the consultation responses and further work, the proposal to Cabinet is to move to an integrated family wellbeing service and to retain 21 family wellbeing centres. And paragraph 40 sets out the new proposals for buildings. The changes from the original proposals are the addition of the Edge in Melton, Shelthorpe in Loughborough, Bagworth, Broughton Astley, Moira, Braunston and Barwell, and the removal of Shepshed. We've undertaken an analysis of each of the buildings, their current usage and rationale for the proposal for each of the buildings. The proposed new service model going forward would be to integrate, as we've said earlier, the 4 early help services together into a single family wellbeing service and provide a core offer for our vulnerable children, young people and their families. In relation to the staff within early help, all of them will be affected to some extent by the new service model. However, as a result of the additional monies and proposed building reductions, the number of staffing reductions has been significantly reduced. So to conclude, the new integrated model will ensure that our early help services are targeted, that they are delivered to those most in need and take a whole family approach with our most vulnerable families. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jane. Right, I'd like to invite Councillor Welsh, please. Sorry. I'll revert to my script. Apologise about that. I will now invite Sue Whiting. Oh, sorry, no. I've gone all panicky now. Yeah. It's because I'm on the wrong side. Could I invite Liz Backshaw to the table, please, to hand in her petition? You will have up to 3 minutes to present the contents to your petition, the comments to your petition.
Thank you very much. My name is Liz Blackshaw. I'm here representing the Save the Children Centres campaign group for Leicestershire. I'm also a volunteer for the National Save the Children's Centres. As you know, wonderful things happen inside children's centres. In the final consultation meeting that we had, Paul and Ivan both said that they felt that children's centres provided excellent work and good value for money. They also said at that meeting that if they were able to keep them all open, that they would, and that news delighted us. This petition is 4,283, but in total for the petitions there were nearly 5,000. It was a decision made by the campaign group that we would do our very best to campaign together. A few centres decided to go it alone, and since Thursday we've become aware that a number of other centres have decided that they would like to run their own petitions as well. I've got over 200 signatures here from Mount Sorrel, for example. So please don't take it as an indication that the other centres weren't interested. We just felt that by banding together we would do better. We were delighted to hear the news that the council had reconsidered their position in light of the petitions, but we were disappointed that given that 2 million had been found, which is more than half the savings that were required, that they felt they could only keep an additional 5 centres open. It was very disappointing news for us, although we felt we had made a moral victory with the petition. The closure of the centres will disproportionately affect women and children within this area because women and children are the main users. In addition to that, the fathers that do wish to get involved will find it more difficult to travel to the centres that are further out. We ask, we beg, we plead, please keep more centres open than this. The centres do absolutely brilliant work. They are vital for the well-being of our children. They are vital for the well-being of their mothers and their fathers. They provide such help and reassurance. Without the children's centres, you will find that children are not at school ready. It's a proven thing for the children's centres. You will find that breastfeeding rates will drop. There just aren't new centres for the breastfeeding volunteer groups to go to. And we are very concerned about this, and we would welcome a chance to work with the council and meet with this council to look at ways that we could keep more centres open.
Thank you for that, Liz. Thank you. I will now open up the item for discussion from the committee. Councillor Welsh. Sorry, Mr. Welsh.
Councillor was fine, Chair. I was happy with that. A major part of the report before us is dealing with the County Council's equality strategy. And as part of that, a full equality and human rights impact assessment has to be done. And that commences from page 20, using the numbering at the top of the pages. I could just want to pick up some themes that run through that before I ask my question, Chair. On page 28, again using the numbers at the top, it talks about problems for disabled people. difficulty using public transport. This could be a parent or carer of a disabled child or a disabled parent carer, and travel difficulties. So clearly some people will jump in their car and move to one of the new centres, and that's relatively straightforward. But we have to be very aware of the situation as for disabled people. Just pick up, so I have done folded pages to get to these. The next one, if we, page 55, it talks there about, again, about children with disabilities on the top right, particularly where the current centres are proposed for redesignation, so they won't have, they'll have to travel for comparable services. And then we get to 62, and I note, it's a note really, that section 3, which is about the mitigation, this part of the assessment hasn't been done yet. So I'm sure Jane will tell us why that is. And just before I finish my question, members will be aware that at page 153, the Leicestershire Equalities Challenge Group did some task and finish work on these matters. And they, on page 154, talk about their views, but they pick up two key issues on the last two paragraphs. The group considers the proposed travel support, along with the use of community venues for delivery of drop-in or group activity, essential to minimise the negative impact of the proposals. And the last paragraph, the group welcomes the intention to explore how volunteer-led universal services could be supported to continue in future. And I think that my view of this paper before us is we may well debate the needs, whether it's central government cuts, what options does a county council have, and I don't think now is the time, in a sense, to deeply debate that. We are where we are. But where we go now with this seems to me the key thing. We need to make sure that people who won't be able to get, we have a sensible and practical model in place to deal with this, and that we actually support the volunteers in more than just a vocal talk shop. We actually offer physical support. Now, my fears are that the bean counters of the county council will spot here the chance not only to make the enormous savings that are here, but they will want more savings and squeeze the stone until some blood drips out of it. Now, I'm not talking about officers here today. I'm not talking about portfolio holders here today. My fear is what others might try to do with this. So I'm looking for reassurance that in going forward, we have a robust scheme and a robust answer to the bean counters to make sure that in making these enormous savings, we fully resource what will be needed to move disabled people, disabled carers, to allow transport for those without transport, and to support the volunteer groups. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Liz, Brennan, can I ask you to go to the public gallery now, please? Thank you very much. Right, Jane, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'll pick up some of them, and my colleague Chris may well help as well. Just in terms of the Appendix 3 around the equality impact assessment, that assessment will be done following Cabinet decision. So it's a much more in-depth assessment around the impact on certainly vulnerable people that are using our centre. So that will be considered afterwards. In relation to the points that you're raising around people with disabilities, children with disabilities and transport, you'll note from page 17 that the maps that we have of our current provision, we don't currently have buildings in every single area of the county anyway. So the way in which the Children's Centre has operated traditionally has Obviously, some people have walked to centres, other people will drive to centres, and in fact, some people are transported into centres. So we don't have county-wide coverage already, so the Children's Centre programme is well used to enabling access to buildings. Now, you're right, in removing buildings, we then remove some of the local access, but our intention is to continue with the same model around enabling access. In fact, what we know with some of our most vulnerable families that actually access in the home in order to bring them into the centre is most effective. So part of the consideration going forward has been, and you'll note from the analysis we've done of each centre, is to understand currently where people live who use our centres, and then to consider how we would continue to enable them to access. I think the points you're raising, particularly around people with disabilities and certainly children with disabilities, again, we have a number of services in the County Council that work with people with disabilities, one of which is the Children's Centre, and it will be of utmost importance to ensure that part of our strategy allows the continued usage of centres where they need to, and where we don't need to deliver within our centres, we'll be delivering provision in the homes. The two other points you raised, one is around volunteering, which as I said in my introduction presentation, we already knew the absolute value of volunteers in delivering not just our Children's Centre programme services, but actually a range of early help services. And actually we heard that even more loudly as part of our consultation with members of the public and indeed some of our volunteers as well. So part of our ongoing strategy will be to ensure that we can retain a solid volunteer base, that where we are looking at not using children's centres anymore, we either rent space or we look at alternative venues to deliver group work from. Already a lot of our volunteer programmes run from buildings that aren't children's centres and run from our local community groups. And one of the points very well made in our consultation is that not all centres are suitable for some of the clinics we run, for example, breastfeeding. So part of what we would need to look at is where there are suitable alternative venues that we can use for that provision. And then finally, your question around assurance about a robust service going forward. I think that's one of the most crucial questions because in terms of what we've developed, we are confident that the service that we are intending to build going forward will be robust. And not only will it be robust, it will be targeted at those families that are most vulnerable. And actually that's where, and we'll know we've been successful when we're able to demonstrate really robust outcomes for all those families as well. So part of the work that Chris has been doing with service managers going forward is working through the evidence-based programmes we would wanting to be using, thinking about the staff groups that we would want to be having in order to ensure that going forward we're able to deliver early intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. That was most helpful.
Thank you. Paul, do you want some comments on that, please?
Just picking up Councillor Walsh's comments about bean counters. So maybe he could clarify. I take it from that you mean our colleagues in the finance section of the council.
Like all these things, chairs, one doesn't want to point the finger too directly at people, but we're all aware of how other officers can often fail to understand the very difficult nature of the service delivery that we have to make. And I want to make sure that anything Scrutiny can do to give power to Ivan's elbow in making sure that the replacement scheme is as good as possible, I'd like to see us back Ivan up and give him that to make sure that a bean counter doesn't inadvertently think that a disabled child is something they needn't worry about. But those who have experienced potholes, grass coming up round our ears, libraries closing next door, will all be aware of what bean counters are capable of doing, Chair.
I feel I should offer some support to my colleagues in the finance section who are, I find, very human people who do totally understand the issues and the difficulties that we face and have actually been very supportive over this issue to the extent that, as was pointed out earlier and the report points out, the Council has identified additional funding to ease some of the changes that we were proposing to have previously in place. So I think that does give an indication of the support that we get in very, very difficult times. So I think the concerns that we have about some of the cuts that we're having to make are equally felt by our colleagues in the finance department.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pendleton.
Thank you, Chairman. I I can't emphasise enough for Councillor Walsh how I do understand the thrust of your questioning, but I think you really have to give credit here to Ivan, who, along with Paul and the team, have made the case very, very well indeed, and found the extra millions, actually, which county have put into this scheme to enable 2 years' worth of integration to take place. I think this is revolutionary. I think this is a report which really is going to be the best possible thing we can achieve for our clients and the usage. And I want to take my hat off to Director and to Jane and Chris as well for actually having the gumption to bring this together. I've got a criticism. The criticism is that the report doesn't highlight SLF enough. I'll be honest. That I looked at that and went, yeah, we're just taking it as read. And that's our model for doing this. Absolutely correct, and that's understood, but I think that we are doing a terrific service for our clients and not a disservice. And I think where you look at the shifts which have taken place after the public consultation, and there have been some, I think that reflects public concern, a real genuineness on behalf of the team to make the changes which will best possibly serve it. It's not a top-down thing, actually. It's a go out and look and really understand the groundwork and talk with the groundwork and talk with the people, on the ground and understand the client's wishes and needs. And I think that's been done absolutely superbly. I do have a problem, though, in 2 years' time. My concern is that have we looked at everything? And this is the question, Chairman. I do apologise for that preface, but I felt I really needed to give credit where I believe credit's due. The question here is this. Health use an awful lot of our facilities. They really do. We are trying to be helpful, collective, integrated. I can see no possible health contribution here in any way, shape or form. And I would just wonder if the bean counters of this world might possibly sort of have a lever here and be approaching our health colleagues for some support post-2020, maybe, or maybe a little earlier. We'll go there, and in whatever way we can. I understand by the grapevine, Chairman, that City already are benefiting from some health contribution in their children's centres and in their approach. And I just wonder whether we could task the team and highlight that for something in the future going forward. Thank you.
Respond.
Thank you, Mr Pendleton, and thank you for your comments. One of the pieces of work that we are doing with colleagues across the partnership, actually including health, is looking at not just the future usage of buildings, but how we may look at future partner contributions going forward. And you'll be well aware that the Support and Leicester Families budget does have partner contributions, and it's one of the ways that we manage to have such a strong service. So we are working with colleagues at the moment about not just future use of buildings, but actually whether or not some of the partner contributions would continue, and obviously those conversations would happen with health as well.
Thank you. Mrs Hack.
Thank you. Obviously, first of all, as local member for Braunston Division, I think it's right of me to say that obviously that my constituents are really happy that Braunston has now been reintroduced as part of the centres that will be kept. I think that's the right decision, knowing how many young people we have locally. You know, I feel for primary schools in my division, so there is a lot of young people that can access that service, and I'm really grateful for that. Although there are obviously other communities that are still have lost out from this proposal. So I think what will be really useful for going forward is, once more detailed work is done, is that we do consider, if there are other centres that need to remain open, that information comes back to us. The point, though, the two areas I would like to ask, though, following on from Jeff's point with regards to children with disabilities, it's about the strength of the response in terms of the equality impact assessment. At the moment, it doesn't seem to be as not as thorough, because that's the wrong word, but I think we could do more with how we are responding to support children with disabilities. I think we already recognise is that families with children with disabilities tend to have to travel further to get services, and that will start from age 0, but it obviously impacts them when the children get to school level as well. So anything that we can do to mitigate the implication on those families will be really helpful, particularly as those families seem to need more support in that transitional phase. And secondly, is just on page 12, there's a response with regards to point 42 about the clawback, and whilst the indication is the risk is minimal, it'd be really useful to understand how far we've gone along with understanding that risk and mitigating that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Jane.
Thank you. I'll pick up the question around clawback, and my colleague will add some more around the equalities impact assessments. We have had a look at the capital clawback figures. The reason why we haven't included the detail of it is because we need to further understand which services or which buildings we would look at redesignating going forward. So we know what the risk is in terms of capital clawback. However, we also know that the mitigation of that risk is quite high. So our intention is that if our proposals are agreed on Friday, we will work towards identifying a future use of all of those buildings. And some of that might be a community use, some of it might be an early years use. So we don't intend to not use the buildings going forward. So we're confident then that the risk of capital clawback will be significantly mitigated, especially if we're able to use that building for continued early years provision going forward. So once we're clear about the proposals going forward, we will be able to then do a thorough analysis around the potential capital clawback risk.
Hi, I'm Chris Thomas, head of the Early Help Services. Just I haven't got a nameplate, so I thought I'd introduce myself. Just wanted to talk about dealing with service users with disabilities. I mean, many of the service users we have are vulnerable for various different reasons, but there's quite a lot we're doing to mitigate the risk around disabilities. I mean, firstly, we've spread the location to the building as much as we can across Leicestershire, so that's almost an obvious statement. But then also we've done some work at looking at some alternative provision that we could use should the need and demand be there. So, but the word I'd use is flexibility. So we're looking at a far more flexible service moving forward. But another point that I'd make is that we're very much focused and have been on ensuring that we provide the most targeted services to the most vulnerable people. A lot of that is done in the home, but we will also look at ways where we can deliver services to those people who come into the buildings by more, if you like, flexible use of transport and those type of issues. But certainly it's something that's heavily in our thinking in terms of the way that we provide a service moving forward.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Chair. Supporting Leicester families. When I joined the council just over, I suppose 5 years ago, it was the flagship thing. It was the thing that everybody was proud of, and the work I'd seen happening or was told that was happening, I was very proud of. What's the future of it? Because taking up Jeff's point, it's not the bean counters, it's the auditors. It's somebody once told me they know the cost of everything but the value of nothing, and that's my concern with auditors and accountants. But I'd like to know, what is the future of this? Where does it fit in? Is it going to continue? Are we reaching the targets on that?
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Chair. So A number of things, really. In terms of the future of supporting Leicestershire families, I'll just pick up the national issue first. So the Troubled Families programme is now in its second phase, and that's due to end at the end of 1920. And by the end of that phase, the expectation is that we will have engaged 2,770 families and as best as possible achieved outcomes for those 2,770 families. And those are targets that are set by national government that we are tasked with meeting as over the course of the programme. At the moment, and in terms of our performance against that, we're doing very well. We remain one of the highest performing authorities nationally and certainly are one of the highest performing authorities regionally in terms of meeting the requirements set out by the national programme. What we don't know is what the future of the national programme will be. So we know that that programme ends in 2020, and obviously, as we've detailed in the report, the loss of that funding does leave us a significant funding gap. And we have no indication as yet from national government about whether or not that scheme will continue, either in its current guise or indeed in another format. But I think, really importantly, the question also needs to relate to Leicestershire. So Leicestershire chose to respond to the Troubled Families Initiative through the development of the Supporting Leicestershire Families programme. We very deliberately broadened our aspirations around that programme to capture a whole range of vulnerable families. And I think what we are proposing through the new Family Wellbeing Service is to take the best of all of our services into the new early help model. So the Supporting Leicestershire Families programme introduced to us the whole family working. Our Children's Centre programme have brought a whole range of positive delivery models. So the new Family Wellbeing Service will take forward Leicestershire's response in terms of providing that whole family approach, the very targeted intervention. So as far as we're concerned, there's two issues. One is the national funding, and we've highlighted that in the report. But locally, our intention is that the philosophy behind the delivery of whole family work won't be lost within the Family Wellbeing Service. I think Chris wanted to add.
Yeah, I'll just add just a couple of points on what Jane's saying. In building the integrated service, so that's integrating a whole family approach with the SLF, with our Children's Centre programme, and with our youth offending service, which deals with a new service, which deals with a whole range of problems, not just youth who've gone to court. What we know from the SLF is that the signal things that have really worked well for us over the last 4 years has been providing the family with a trusted worker who provides mentoring and support to a family that then gives them a wraparound service to the family, which provides them with practical help and enables them to move to be more self-sufficient. And also that support coordinates services around a family. We will continue with that approach, but we want to broaden that approach into dealing with some families who've got difficulties. They've got 0 to 2 year olds. Some families have got a difficult teenager. And whilst we've been doing good work in those areas, we really want to take that philosophy and principles from what we've learnt to the SLF across the whole of our integrated service. So by bringing things together, a lot of that philosophy that we've picked up from 4 years learning will move across into our integrated early help service. That gives you some reassurance.
Mr. Old.
Thank you, Chair. First, I'd like to start where Chris has just finished. I think this committee, and indeed the Council, should be very grateful to colleagues in the Children and Families Service for coming up with a concept of a 0 to 19 family wellbeing service. It removes duplication, it brings assets together, it will provide something that we didn't have before in a more constructive and dedicated way. And in those services, if I take youth offending as one, they are constantly having to publish outcomes. If I look at the Supporting Leicestershire Families programme, which I've been involved with since it was set up, one of the early areas that I insisted had to be brought in was a means of measuring family progress. And we have the Family Star diagram. That's why when the Daily Mail rabbits on about how inadequate Troubled Families programme is, to use their expression, not mine, I'm in a position of saying, well, actually, as far as Leicestershire is concerned, we can prove it very, very differently because we had the foresight to put in that tight criteria in the beginning. When I come to children's centres, the quality of the work that goes on there is not in question. But I said to Jane when I read the report, actually the outcomes from what goes on in children's centres is not as easy to identify as you can for Youth Offending Service or for the Supporting Leicestershire Families programme. And I think that's an area for the future that we have to look at. What are the actual outcomes? It was also very clear in the very poorly attended public consultation meetings that I went to, just to remind the committee, nobody turned up at Market Harborough. One person came to Beesham College. One came to the Marlene Road Centre in Colville. 4 were at Laysland. 5 came to the Melton Mowbray one. It wasn't until we got to Hinckley and then to Rosebery that we even got into double figures. And if I compare the response rate to the number of parents who took part in the recent survey for holiday dates, where we got over 6,000 responses, and over Maplewell Hall, where we had over 10,000 names handed in on the petition, what I'm locating is putting those who are concerned and the way they express that concern through petitions into the context of other responses that we've had. I don't like closing children's centres. I'm not even going to pretend that I like doing it. I think they do very valuable work. But I do believe that when they were set up in the first place by the then Labour government, the Labour government missed a very comprehensive opportunity of saying that this is something that all children should do. And they didn't do that. And we heard stories at some of the meetings of children arriving at school at 5, unable to use the toilet, never been taught by their parents to use the toilet, and had never been to a children's centre. We are reading stories in our national press of children who are inarticulate because their parents are spending so much time on their mobile phones. And if ever there was a point in time where, in order to help the child, some further beefing up of the requirement to attend could take place, it probably is now in the light of the evidence that we've got. I will be recommending to Cabinet that we accept the recommendations of the officers. I think they've done a really good job. And while a few people turned up, what it enabled me to do, because I was at all of these, apart from the one that Trevor Pendleton attended for me, was to really sit down and listen to how the officers had arrived at their conclusions. I did feel a little bit ambushed, I must admit, over in Loughborough, but challenges come along and you have to respond to them as and where they come along. I'm quite confident in the report at the moment, and Jane, by the way, you owe me 20 pence for the fining fund for using the term troubled families, because in Leicestershire we've always used the term supporting families. It's far less pejorative and it's far more supportive, and I wish the government would learn that, because it would help when you're trying to sell it. I think the officers deserve top-class marks and they've done an excellent job. I'm not going to pretend it's all going to be smooth. It isn't. But then I look at the division that I represent. There isn't a children's centre in it. So the notion of transportation is one that anybody who has a need to go in the Market Bosworth division is already taxied in. And at the very first Cabinet meeting, we were told that the taxiing in will continue. So it's already happening in parts of the county where there isn't a children's centre within 15 miles of where some people live, and where there are no east to west public transport services, and therefore it can happen elsewhere. And I commend the report to the Scrutiny.
Thank you, Mr. Old. Mr. Meredith.
I just wanted to remind colleagues, I know we talk a lot about this, into the national context in which is happening here. The LGA, Local Government Association, has identified that there's £600 million worth of pressures this year in children's services, and over the next 3 to 4 years there'll be another £2 billion worth of pressures in those services. I was at a meeting in London last week with one of the civil servants who works on I'm going to get in trouble again now, the Troubled Families Programme, because that's what the government calls it. It's their language, not mine. I did actually in the meeting make the point that we call it Supporting Leicestershire Families here, and that was a better title. I'm not sure that's going to go very far, but there you are. There is no indication at this time that he's aware of that there will be any further funding going forward. But, I mean, there is a year or two's time to perhaps reassess that, although we're acutely aware of all the pressures in the government and the need to make additional funding available for the National Health Service. So I just wanted to remind members and colleagues about that. The other thing I wanted to say about Leicestershire is that we are fighting very hard to keep our early help offer, and some other councils have more or less done away with their early help offer altogether. Some councils have no children's centres at all operating. So yes, this is sad that we have to go through this, but we've all fought very hard to try to keep as much as we can of what is a very outstanding service in Leicestershire, and hopefully, given the context in which we work in, I do think that we've been quite successful in achieving that, even though we would all like it to be a lot bigger than it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody that's put this together. I find it a very interesting report, and the officers have obviously considered and the lead members and everyone has worked jolly hard to make sure as much can be covered as possible. As it's been said, nobody wants to have to close centres of any type, and particularly anything to do with children and young families and supporting families. But having read through the report, I noticed, particularly on the ones that we're now redesignating, is that some of the places the building was leased, so I presume that would mean, and I'm sure the lead member and Jane will be able to answer this, is it could be possible that suddenly the lease would expire and we'd have to start renegotiating. Also, some of the buildings that have been used, either leased or owned by the LCC, have not been really suitable buildings and have suitable facilities to carry out the modern things that they would like to do. I would, for example, I look at 135, which is Ibstock. I look at Mount Sorrel, could work. These are leased buildings. My question is, besides asking for the comments on that, is where there are buildings that are owned by the county council and are going to be redesignated, so therefore we're taking this part of the building away, and I think the lead mentioned that the building will still continue. But if the only people that are using the building are the ones that are to do with children and supporting families, for example, a breastfeeding cafe and things like that, even though it's owned by the council and we're moving away, is it likely that those type of things will move with us? And my second part of the question was, where places that are being redesignated, and obviously we're moving to other places like Shelthorpe or other places, will the facilities there and the staff there be able to support the extra work that could be coming? For example, in Shelthorpe, they could be getting the people from Cobden Street. So will that be taken into account? So actually it's for both of you, really. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pick up both of those areas. So in terms of the buildings that we're proposing to redesignate, part of the proposals or recommendations to Cabinet is that the Director is able to then go away and scope up a buildings plan. So part of our equality impact assessment is about the impact on service users of the building, and we're undertaking that impact whether it's a leased building or a owned building, because actually what's really important is the services that are delivered from those buildings. So once we are clear about the impact and have worked through plans for mitigating impacts, so use of other buildings, all of those, we'll then work with either the owner of the building building or other potential parties to use the building to then consider what the future use of that building can be. And obviously we won't have started that work until we've got agreement from Cabinet to go forward. So in terms of all of the buildings, obviously the ones where we're leasing, we would be able to give notice, but we would need to make sure that we didn't give notice if we were continuing to run programmes. So there'll be quite a complex piece of work going forward around redesignating those buildings. In terms of the buildings that we're proposing to continue to use going forward, you're absolutely right that part of our consideration, and hence why they're on the proposed list, is because we consider that those buildings are suitable going forward for use, not just in terms of delivering what we already do through the Children's Centre programme, but actually that they would lend themselves to be buildings where we could deliver 0 to 19 programmes from. We're confident that they could cope with increased footfall, but actually more importantly, they're buildings where we have good access, that it would be okay for parents of children who are older to go onto site, that potentially they'd be open in the evenings. There's been a whole raft of thinking about that group of buildings going forward. But also, we know that by reducing the number of buildings, we aren't going to be able to deliver everything from those buildings. So the other bit of work that we have started to look at is what other buildings are available to deliver. And again, as I've outlined in previous reports, the Children's Centre programme deliver from our children's centres, but our Supporting Leicestershire Families Service, our Youth Offending Service, and indeed our Early Help Information Service run from other buildings. So the majority of the work that we do isn't delivered within our Children's Centre programme. We already rent buildings, we already work in people's homes. So part of our journey forward will be to take a similar model across the entirety of the 0 to 19 Family Wellbeing Service. Just so you know.
Thank you. Does anybody want to add anything more to that? Chris?
Yeah, just a couple of minor points, really. Certainly, the word flexibility is one that I'd keep using, in as much as even with our workforce, we're looking moving forward. They're kind of attached to buildings at the moment, but what we really want to do is them attached to areas, so we can be far more flexible about the provisions we put on in certain sites, looking at other sites in the same area or nearby, and having the flexibility in our staff arrangements and admin to actually move to where we need to be. So certainly, whilst we have cut the sites, that word flexibility is really important, because moving forward we do want a far more flexible way in which we're going to reach service users and use some of the buildings that we've got and some of the buildings we may want to rent as we move forward for specific purposes. If that helps.
Mrs. Page.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a very basic question, because this has been very well aired and I can only add my thanks. But in the long term, this is also a prevention measure. And we're talking about saving in the future by putting in the right resources in the beginning. Now, we know that we have been a very underfunded authority. Lead member has been active in getting funding for schools, etc. So I understand that through the grapevine that with 20 million that is supposed to be allocated to the NHS, and as Trevor alluded, we are going to face further probably strains on our resources. Now, I would like to ask the lead member a very, very basic question. What are we doing politically to ensure, as Paul mentioned earlier on, the ministers don't know what can we do, what are we doing to ensure that government knows how valuable these programs are to save resources at the end of the day, and rather than ensuring rightly or whatever that the NHS and Defence get the money, that we also get a fair share of this money to deliver a service that will in the long run brings savings to the system at large. Thank you.
Mr. Old.
Thank you, Chair. Well, you know that the Deputy Leader has been conducting a very vigorous campaign with Jeff, dare I say it, the bean counters, as it were, in London, pointing out how much per head is spent in some authorities and how little per head of population we get in Leicestershire. It's a matter of fact, and you can check it for yourselves, that there's less money paid for a Band D house in Islington than in Leicestershire. And that can't be right, because there are needs across the country and those needs are not recognised. Just across the road from us is a Leicestershire primary school. And on the other side of the road, a bit further down, is a Leicester City primary school. And the difference per pupil is nearly £1,000 per pupil per year. And you're right that I've been arguing for schools for a long time. Shortly to hand over that mantle to a new chair of the F40 group, because I'm going to rest on my laurels of persuading the government last year to put 1.3 billion more into schools, which has percolated out. I'm also tasked to talk with, and indeed have already done so, both the LGA and Joe Took, who is the national lead for the Troubled Families Programme. The officers are going to have a grin at my expense here. I cannot conceive that any government can stop funding a programme which has shown itself to be as successful as SLF has done. And I think if you look at youth offending, look at the actual figures and compare our figures to other parts of the East Midlands and to the wider areas in England. We deliver quality services. You can't thin them out too much, otherwise you deliver substandard services. So sometimes you have to make a choice in terms of quality and poor provision, substandard provision. Part of the arguments behind this paper would indicate that. But I'd like to reassure every member of the Cabinet, the £1 million additional money didn't come about because I asked for it. It came about because every department here at County Hall understands that if you don't give early help, you end up paying far more for chronic and acute cases further down the road. And we do not want to see an even bigger increase in children coming into care than we've already got. Now, we've, in the medium-term financial strategy, catered for a 10% increase in children coming into care for the current financial year. At the moment, that figure is running at 4%. If that can stay that way for the rest of the year, it gives just a little bit of flexibility. But if, on the other hand, it goes up to 14% and we are overspending as a department again, you then begin to look at what you have to provide by statute as distinct from what you provide because you know it actually benefits people, but it isn't statutorily required. So I think we are where we are at the moment. I would rather have quality services, marginally smaller, than I would thin the cake to such a degree that what you've got is something that if Ofsted came in would either be deemed inadequate or requires improvement.
Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Chair. There's a lot that I agree with the lead member, and you make a good case. But can I just ask you to be careful how you argue it, because you said just now that the schools in the county, the pupils in the schools in the county, get £1,000 less per year than in the city. So why do you think, if they get £1,000 less in Oadby, the Oadby schools are full up with children of residents of the city of Leicester, and Oadby children can't get into Oadby schools, hence the number of appeals here. So I assume it's the way we spend the money is just as important as the money we get. It's absolutely deplorable, and I just wonder if the parents who are sending their kids to Oadby and the local schools round are realising they're denying their child of £1,000 worth of education by forcing them into Oadby schools.
Mr. Old.
Thank you, Chair. it remains a moot point. If we had Tom Goldman, who is a civil servant from the DFE, sitting in the room, he would say to you, well, actually, no, they're going to bring that money with them, except that I can't find any evidence that a procedure exists to allow them to do that. So who is the beneficiary? Well, it isn't the city, and it certainly isn't the county. It is the DFE itself. It has the money in the DFE coffers, and we all know that the Education, Skills and Funding Agency is an unaccountable quango,
Bean counters.
characterised at the moment by allowing academies to overspend. 80% are now in deficit, something that I would have probably been sacked for if we'd had something similar happening in the county. F40 is arguing the case very strongly, and if I may, Chair, I'll finish on a name-dropping note. Only last Monday, I had a meeting with Damien Hines, the Secretary of State with Education, leading a delegation from F40 to argue the case that the government may have got a national funding formula, but it sure as hell isn't fair.
Mrs. Hack.
Just coming back to children's centres.
Yes, thank you.
I think earlier the lead member identified that it's really hard to quantify output from the children's centre. I think that's because it is in some respects unquantifiable. So my personal experience of using a children's centre is I went to a breastfeeding support clinic. My daughter, as I said, in full counsel, has multiple allergies, and it was a children's centre member of staff that actually helped me with that journey, so to speak. My son really struggled with his transition into primary school. I went to a children's centre who gave me support with that. So you can't quantify it, and I think that is really difficult. But actually, every individual child that accesses a children's centre will get some benefit, as will the parent. I think the only thing that I would say in terms of shrinking the number of centres is and the impact that has on communities. You're more likely to be able to gravitate towards people who live close by, because they will then be friends for life. And there are certainly parents that I'm still in contact with now. My daughter's 7, and I'm still in contact with a parent I met at the children's centre. So I think that is one thing that we do lose by shrinking the number of centres, is the ability that when you become a parent, it can be a pretty lonely existence, because you may not be the only person in your friendship group that's having that child at that time. So being able to expand that, I think, would be really helpful, is if we could look at the impact of loneliness with parents and making sure those community links aren't forgotten, and particularly with parents where the children have special needs, because that is such a difficult time, and I can obviously say that for my daughter doesn't have special needs. She has multiple allergies, but speaking to another parent in exactly the same boat was a huge comfort for me, and I'm sure that's the same for children with all kinds of different needs. And I just wanted to hope that could be considered going forward.
Thank you. I certainly concur with the loneliness that some parents do have. But there are an awful lot of community groups out there with mums and toddlers, grandmas and toddlers, as I'm finding out at the moment. But as my kids have pointed out to me, they've got a very active mother. And for young mothers that haven't got their mother there or a family there, I think even my children might be suffering now from that. I'm going to close this now, unless you want to come something. Sorry? Yes, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on both of those points, really. Firstly, around the children's centre outcomes. I think you're absolutely right. In terms of monitoring the outcomes of any early help service is really difficult, because what we're doing is working to prevent things happening. However, we do know that satisfaction of services within children's centres is exceptionally high. And we know that those people that use children's centres report incredibly positively about the changes and impact it's had on their lives. Also, I think really importantly to note that when I talked earlier about the progress that we're making towards the national programme, it isn't just the results from supporting Leicestershire families that we report on. We take outcomes from the Children's Centre as well. So they've been a significant contributor towards our payment by results. So we are able to get those outcomes from people who attend children's centres as well as those who use our supporting Leicestershire families. I think the other point I just wanted to pick up, and I know Chris wants to just add as well, is that the issue around locality support is absolutely crucial. And what we heard when we went out to some of the consultation, but also what we know, is the importance of locality networks. I think a couple of things really important. One is that as we go into the future in terms of developing a service, the youth volunteers, the locality support we're provided, we're intending to provide, should enable that to continue. However, the only other bit I would want to add is that I, like many mothers, was on maternity leave in a place where there were no children's centres, and we, the Children's Centre, supported the delivery of a group in a non-children's centre building. So actually, I feel really optimistic about, and I feel very strongly about the need for locality support, but I don't think that always needs to happen through a children's centre. And actually, we've got some really strong groups that are run across the county that take place in libraries, in village halls, in coffee shops, and some of that has been facilitated by Children's Centre. I think the importance is the point you're making around us making sure that we still enable families to access support where they can, when that can't be done through the buildings.
I'd just like to make a couple of, I'm almost bursting to make a couple of further points. The first one's about, if you like, data and performance. I think that we know the benefits of having children's centre programmes and some of the things that you said, Councillor, but we've been collecting data now for just over a year on trajectory of some of the children that the children's centre programmes are dealing with, and we will be moving. One of the things that we want to do in the future is moving to looking at the trajectory of the children that we touch in terms of communication, cognitive skills, physical skills, because we'll be able to do that because we've been collecting the data on the young people and the children that we've been working with. And I think that's really important. That'll tell us a lot of things. It will tell us perhaps where we're strong, where we're not so strong, and it'll enable us to move forward with the programme and also build even greater links between the Children's Centre programme and early years provision and what's happening in early years settings. So that's the first thing that I want to talk about, and that's a bit about the future, about the integrated service. The second point is just a small point, but I think it's really important. With the way that we're able to go and the way that we're able to look at the changes, given the financial savings now, is that volunteering is something that we want to invest in, and probably invest in a little bit more, even though we're shrinking. And one of the reasons for that is that volunteers do completely different things to our officers, and where they provide support to other people going through the same issues or problems that they've had, and also that relationship of a non-paid person to support somebody who understands their problem. We don't underestimate the value of that, and we do want to keep supporting the volunteer programme. And indeed, our youth support services and our children's centre each have around 100 volunteers, and we've got a bit of support around that. We would hope to grow that volunteer base and just increase the support, because it's really important that you don't ask volunteers to work with you and then not provide them support with training, development, opportunities to develop themselves. So it's something that we're really wedded to increasing under our service. I just wanted to make, because there's really two real points. The future is challenging, but it is going to look different as well.
This paper has been described as revolutionary. However, I think that the report is measured and considered, very forward-looking, planning for the future, and will ensure that there will be targeted help to vulnerable children and far more able to support Leicestershire families in the future. Thank you for taking part in this. I'd like to ask if there's any more comments before I close the meeting. Thank you. date of the next meeting is September the 10th, 2018 at 1:30. Thank you.